If you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the business of lifelong learning, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
And I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to episode 122 of the Leading Learning Podcast. In this episode, we talk with Nasos Papadopolous. Nasos is the founder of Metalearn, a web destination for learning about learning. He's also a university lecturer and an online course author, and as you might expect, an avid learner himself. Before we get to the interview with Nasos, though, we want to acknowledge our sponsor for the first quarter of 2018.
We're happy to have Blue Sky eLearn sponsoring this quarter. Blue Sky is the maker of the Path Learning Management System, an award-winning cloud-based learning solution that empowers your organization to maximize its message. Blue Sky also provides a range of virtual event and instructional services to help you maximize your content and create deeper engagement with your audience. To find out more about Blue Sky and everything it offers, visit blueskyelearn.com.
For our resource for this episode, we're going to link to the Metalearn YouTube channel, where Nasos Papadopoulos has published dozens of brief videos covering topics ranging from how to learn from famous figures like Elon Musk, Marie Curie, and Charles Darwin to how to leverage important learning techniques like space practice, reflection, and elaboration. This is a great resource to help you boost your own learning and also a great resource to share with the learners you serve. You can find the link for the Metalearn videos by visiting the show notes for this episode at leadinglearning.com/episode 122. Now, Jeff, you were the one who got to talk with Nasos. Would you give us a brief taste of what you guys talked about?
Definitely. I'll mention that I first connected with Nasos probably about a year ago or so because he reached out to me to interview me for his Metalearn podcast, and we'll link to that interview, and also really highly recommend the podcast. That's a big part of what he's up to at Metalearn, and it was a true pleasure talking with him then, and we've stayed in touch since and have talked a number of times, and and it just seemed like a natural to at some point have him come on Leading Learning since he is so incredibly focused on learning. And in our conversation for this episode, we covered everything from what metalearning is and how he became so focused on it as a topic. We talk about podcasting. We talk about his experience with authoring an online course. And as you might expect, Nasos also offered one of the great answers we've had so far to our usual question about a learning experience that's had significant impact on him since leaving his formal schooling behind. So, I knew it was going to be an interesting conversation, and it certainly it turned out that way.
Well, I look forward to hearing the conversation, so let's roll the interview with Nasos Papadopoulos.
Hello out there, I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast. And today I am joined by Nasos Papadopoulos. Nasos is the founder of Metalearn, which I would describe as a destination on the web for learning about learning. He's a university lecturer, an avid learner himself, and I've heard rumors that he plays a mean game of tennis. Nasos, welcome to the Leading Learning Podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm so glad to have you here because we've, gotten to know each other a little bit over the course of the last year or so, and I've followed what you're doing on the web with Metalearn, but I think just so listeners are really familiar with what you're up to, because some of them may not be, we should probably tackle this whole topic of metalearning right up front. At this point, you have a whole business dedicated to it, and you're obviously very passionate about this topic of metalearning, but can you say just a bit more about what you mean by metalearning and then why you think it's something that deserves the kind of focus that you're giving it?
Sure. So I would define metalearning as the process of learning how to learn. So the analogy that I often kind of use when I talk about metalearning is sort of zooming in and zooming out. So you want to be able to zoom out enough to be aware of what you're actually doing when you're picking up a new skill, whether that is playing an instrument, learning a language, picking up a sport, learning a professional skill, whatever it might be. you'll sort of probably get to know over the course of this interview that I'm a very proud Greek, so I'll be throwing my etymologies around here, there, and everywhere. The term meta, the prefix, actually comes from the ancient Greek meta, which means to go above or beyond. And so that's exactly what you're doing when you are meta learning. You're zooming out, you're taking a step back, you're becoming more aware of your own learning, and as a result, you're better able to improve it and make faster progress in whatever you're doing.
And so it's funny you brought up the Greek background, because that's something I wanted to ask about, and maybe it's connected to why you're so interested in this. I mean, obviously, Greece, the founding place of philosophy, love of knowledge, and I think philosophy these days has become something kind of abstract, but back in the beginning, it was all about learning. I mean, does your Greek background, did that influence you, or what else influenced you to become so passionate about this?
Yeah, I mean, the Greek background is definitely a big thing. It's something that's actually developed more in the last few years since I've started MetaLearn, because I've become a lot more aware of what actually I'm super interested in and what matters to me. And we'll go into the whole piece about meaning and how important that is for learning at some point later if you want to. But the thing that actually got me interested in MetaLearning in the first place was when I graduated from university. I kind of did a bit of a U-turn. So I've been planning to go into finance. I did a degree in economics and management, did a bunch of internships in investment banks, and eventually decided that it wasn't for me. So I kind of had to, as I say, do a bit of a U-turn and massively reevaluate what I was doing with my life, what I wanted to do for my career. So I quickly realized that, hey, I'm going to need to learn a bunch of new skills. I don't think they actually ever taught us how to learn that efficiently at school, so let me look into that. I was also tutoring part-time, which was a fantastic option for me because it also allowed me to kind of stay flexible and experiment with other things. And obviously, I also wanted to help my students learn effectively. So that really sparked the interest in diving into research on neuroscience, cognitive science, reading as much as I could get my hands on about the learning process. And of course, just kind of trying to observe as much as I could in my own practical learning and teaching experience. But to return to the piece on Greece, I mean, yeah, it's been a massive inspiration, and it does inform a lot of my thinking and reading. And I'm always looking back whenever I come across a new concept. I go back and say, oh, I wonder what Plato or Aristotle said about this. Yeah, it's always close to my heart, that's for sure.
Well, you've got the Greek last name, but I'm sure listeners will notice right away that you've got a British accent to go with that. Did you come up in the British school system, and wherever you came up, how well prepared were you to be a better learner, basically?
So yeah, I did. I grew up in London, here in the UK. And went through a very good secondary school, what you guys over in the US would call high school. And then I applied to Oxford to study economics and management, managed to get in after a pretty rigorous sort of applications process, and then did my 3-year degree. Now, in terms of the skills that I think my education gave me, looking back at it certainly gave me an ability to communicate effectively. So to write clearly, to speak clearly, to make logical arguments, which I think are extremely important, and very often undervalued by people who are too focused on just pure instrumental skills. What I think it didn't give me was sort of a perspective of where the world was going. And also specifically around learning, there wasn't really any information. I was never taught how to learn. And I think all of my peers that I went to school with would probably say the same thing. There was, had I known, to put it in simple terms, had I known then what I know now, I think I would have been a much, much more effective student. And while I did do well, I certainly had to put in a lot of hours. And sometimes it was a pretty long, hard slog, especially in my final year, when I had a lot of exams. So yeah, good and bad. Definitely a lot of important general skills, but certainly not enough around learning, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's funny. I always think of that, says Rod Stewart in the Faces that cut it originally. I wish I knew now, or wish I knew then what I know now, or how's it go? I wish I knew now when I was younger, basically. Good song, but I always think of that because same feeling that, you get older and you realize how much you didn't know earlier, and that you didn't necessarily know how to know. Didn't know how to learn things. Now, I'm wondering. You've got you had this issue, and it sent you down this path of learning to become a meta learner, learning how to learn. You've now got thousands of people, presumably following you on your blog, on your podcast. What's motivating those people? I mean, what do you hear from your subscribers, your listeners about what they're looking for and why they're attracted to MetaLearn?
So I think like the work that I'm doing is certainly picking up on a problem that a lot of people have at the moment. And that's a good thing because obviously I set out trying to solve my own problem. And obviously it happens to be a problem that a lot of other people have. I think that problem is the difficulty around taking a sort of structured approach to your learning after you leave school, after you leave the educational system. Because it's very, very challenging, especially once you get into the world of work, where you have responsibilities, you have commitments, and also we're living in a world full of noise where it's kind of difficult to identify what is good and what is important and what isn't. So MetaLearn really is trying to solve these problems, to say to people, first of all, yes, you can continue to learn throughout your life if you go about it in the right way. Here are some sort of tools and techniques that you can kind of add to your toolkit to make that process more effective in the limited time that you have. And then here are also some other things that are super important to make you like an effective person in the 21st century, which are things like critical thinking and independent thinking, being exposed to sort of multiple perspectives, and sort of, asking those big and important questions, not just about where the world is going, but about what's important to you.
And do you think that the people who seek you out and engage with those kinds of questions, see the right way to put this, are they special or are they average people? And I'm asking this from the perspective of, I guess, whether you tend to be cynical or optimistic about the desire, the willingness, the ability of people to embrace this idea of being better learners, realizing, that it is a skill they need to have these days. I mean, do you think most people get that, or the people who are tuning into you, maybe outside the average a little bit?
Well, I think it's a great question because it's a question that I ask myself a lot, and I have asked myself a lot over the course of building MetaLearn out and the stuff that I've done. I think people are starting to recognize that it is extremely important, just because if you look at the trends in our society more broadly, things are changing so fast that we really do need to be picking up new things every day, every week, every month. And I don't think that's an exaggeration anymore. And so I think people are realizing, hey, this is something I actually really do need to think about, because the job that I'm doing right now may not exist in 15, 20 years time. The base of knowledge that I'm able to sort of make a living off now, that might not be a valuable resource in that same kind of time frame. And so I think people are starting to recognize the need. Now, of course, there is always a degree of cynicism about how meta do you get about stuff. Like if you keep abstracting and abstracting and abstracting, you're getting so far away from the practical experience of learning that it can become meaningless. And so what I always try and do with my work is that I try and ground it in concrete examples in my own teaching and learning experience, so that it's not just intellectualizing about the learning process. Because, of course, the goal behind all of this is to get people to take real action in their lives that is going to allow them to develop the skills that they need to thrive. And
you alluded to this, that people may be dealing with situations where, for example, the nature of their work changes radically, maybe their job disappears. I'm interested, how tuned in are you to developments in areas like, for example, the big one, artificial intelligence, right now, which it seems to me is really going to change the learning landscape significantly, because it may mean that we don't even need to learn certain things anymore, and that we need to learn completely new things. So I just love your perspective on what you see happening in an area like artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, those things that are potentially opportunities, but potentially also threatening to human beings, and obviously are going to have an impact in one way or another on learning.
Sure. So I would say a couple of things. First of all, in terms of specific trends and where I see those technologies going, I don't think I know enough about them to make sort of a qualified prediction. But what I will say is this. I've identified that those are areas that are fundamentally going to change the world. And so I am being a lot more proactive about learning about them. So if you go and look at my kind of podcast guests over the last few months, you'll see that there are a lot more technologists and people who are involved in this space. I just interviewed Tim Urban from Wait But Why, who's been having a lot of conversations about artificial intelligence with Elon Musk and the work he's been doing at Neuralink. I just think it's something, without wanting to be too prescriptive, and I'm always hesitant to be, I really think those technologies that you just mentioned are things that everybody should be getting at least a working knowledge of, because they could potentially completely disrupt your career and life in ways that you can't even imagine. So it makes sense to understand sort of that landscape. The second piece I'll just add to that is how important I think it is that we think critically about these technologies, because I think one thing that I'm seeing again and again and again in the conversation in this space is sort of any attempt to kind of engage in critical thinking or questioning about where these technologies are actually going is kind of met with, comments about being branded as a techno-skeptic or a Luddite, etc. And while I think it's really important that we don't put a brake on technological progress because it can solve, some really serious problems for us, I think bringing more of sort of a critical conversation and debate around technologies is super important, because we can see a lot of sort of companies recently, without wanting to name names, have abused the power that sort of accelerated returns from technology has given them. So I think bringing those questions, bringing that debate into the space around technology is super important.
Definitely. And as you're saying, I think everybody really needs to have a fundamental awareness of a basic awareness of what's going on in these areas at this point, and an understanding of what the implications could be. Nobody really knows at this point, but certainly things are pointing in certain directions that we want to be aware of. Now, you just referenced your interviews, a specific guest, and one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I'd really like to dig in a little bit to the podcast and kind of how things work there. And a key question would be, how do you decide that somebody is a good candidate to come on the Metalearn podcast? What are the characteristics of a great guest for you that's really going to help you dig into this topic and address your listeners' needs?
Great question, and also is one that I ask myself a lot, and the conditions have changed over time. What I look for now in a guest, I could probably boil down to sort of three main things. So one of them is just purely based off of personal interest. So if I'm reading a book about a subject that interests me, very often I might, after I filter for these other two conditions that I'm about to mention, reach out to the author. So it has to be something that I'm interested in currently, or something that sparked my curiosity. Because I feel that always brings out the best in a guest, is when the interviewer is genuinely interested in what they have to say, and they actually want to find out. And it's not just an interview for the purpose of doing an interview. So that's one. Am I interested in the person's work right now? Two would be, are they a good communicator? And the reason I say this is because I have had interviews in the past where the person is an exceptional expert in their subject, and they really do know an awful lot. But obviously, a big part of what I'm doing is for listeners at Metalearn, and I want them to be able to get the best possible experience. And sometimes experts aren't always the best, or certain kinds of experts are not always the best communicators. And so
right.
what I'll do is I'll go and sort of see, have they done any talks on YouTube? Have they done any other podcasts? Do I think they would come across well and be able to communicate their knowledge effectively? That's the key. It's not the question of do they have it or not. It's can they communicate it effectively to the listeners that are tuning in to learn more about what they do. And then I guess the final piece would just be, are they saying something original? Are they saying something a little bit different? Because, in a lot of spaces, people tend to say the same things over and over and over again, or to say the same things in the same way. And so what I'm really looking for in a guest is, Are they saying something original, or are they saying something that we all know to be a truth, and looking at it from a different perspective, which generates that interest and that curiosity from me as well? So I'd say those things are the filter conditions.
And I won't put you on the spot to, name a best interview, but I would be interested, are there one or two that stick out in your mind at this point? And I'm not sure how many you've done. Maybe you can tell us that too, but that stick out in your mind is just very memorable. And then why? Why were they so memorable?
Sure. I mean, there's loads, but there are a couple that do stick out. So I yesterday published episode 106. So I've done over 100 episodes. Now, admittedly, I would say between 35 and 40 of those are shorter episodes where I'm either doing like a solo recording about a subject, or I'm having somebody jump in and do a conversation with me about a particular topic for, say, 20 minutes or so. So there's about, give or take 70 people that I've interviewed. The ones that stick out, the ones that came to mind right now when you asked that question were, the first one was with Seth Godin. And Seth was just a fantastic guest in so many ways. But the kind of things that I really took away from that were how human his approach to business is. We were talking a little bit about sales towards the end of that conversation. And it was very top of mind for me at the time because I was starting to sell my first course, Make Me a Metalearner. And, you become very conscious when you go into that sales process of like wanting to do it with integrity and wanting to do it the right way. And just the conversation we had around that was super, super useful. And gave a lot of clarity. And the one particular thing to give you kind of a solid takeaway that I took from that was when Seth basically said, the reason that most people aren't good salesmen is because they're selfish. Like they won't recommend you to a competitor's product when it's a better solution, because ultimately sales is about serving people. So that was a very, very powerful conversation. And I really took a lot from that. And Seth was just a very, very, a phenomenal guest to interview. The other one was a great conversation with Barry Schwartz. Barry Schwartz has been a professor of psychology at Swarthmore, recently retired, but taught at Swarthmore for 40 years, I believe, and has written a couple of excellent books, one on the paradox of choice and one on practical wisdom. And so the conversation we had was sort of a little bit more of a philosophical one, although, of course, there were kind of implications for learning, etc. And again, if I had to say one particular takeaway from that conversation, it would be, again, sort of towards the end of the conversation when we started talking about this concept of good enough. And I think in our societies, certainly in Anglo-Saxon societies in the West, we kind of have this obsession with thinking that everything could always be better. And especially in a world where the media is constantly showing us examples of success stories, it can sometimes be very hard to be satisfied with what you've got. And so you're always thinking about the next best career opportunity, the next best learning project, the next best whatever. And the kind of practical wisdom of sometimes just saying, you know what, I think I've got it pretty good, really kind of came home in that episode. And I think he communicated it brilliantly. So yeah, those would be two episodes that stuck out and a couple of learnings from them.
Those are great. I've heard Brene Brown recently. I've been listening to her talk about that kind of good enough concept as well in very interesting ways. But those are two guests, Barry Schwartz and Seth Godin, I would love to have on Leading Learning at some point. So kudos for getting the quality of guests that you do get on Metalearn. I know that takes some footwork to make happen just based on our own experience. And I'd love to ask just one other question about the podcast, and this one is partly selfish, just because obviously I do this. I podcast, and I'm always interested in knowing how other people go about it. But I know we also have listeners who either have podcasts or are interested in launching them and growing them. And so, as you just mentioned, you're past 100 episodes now. You're well established. You've got a good following at this point. What are some of the key pieces of advice you would give to somebody at this point who wanted to launch and grow a podcast?
Sure. So as a quick caveat before I kind of start the answer, this advice is tailored towards people who want to launch one. So it may not apply to you if you're 20 episodes, 50 episodes, 100 episodes in, like me. So I would say to people thinking about launching a podcast, just start. I mean, first of all, I mean, it is the biggest cliche, but it exists for a reason, which is that you will learn so much once you actually start. And there are only so many how-to guides and, 7 steps to starting a podcast that you can possibly read before you just have to take the plunge, record that first episode, and kind of see where it goes. So just start. And for me, what that actually means on a concrete, practical level is book your first interview in if you're doing an interview podcast. Or if you're doing a solo podcast, block out some time in your calendar when you're going to do it. So reach out to someone that you think you can get, or reach out to a bunch of people. As you were alluding to before, it can be quite a lot of legwork sometimes. So you sometimes need to ask more than once and ask a lot of people. And book that interview into the calendar. I recommend doing it over Skype to start off with, just because, again, it is low resource. It's easy to do. All you need is a set of earbuds or headphones from your phone. And if you want, you can buy a simple USB mic to get you started off. We're both using the Audio-Technica ATR 2100, which is excellent, and I think in the range of like $60, $70, but produces awesome audio quality. So 1, to summarize that whole piece, just get started. 2, I would also think, which kind of in some ways contradicts this first kind of point, but I would also think a little bit about kind of what's the theme and who is it for? Like, you've got to ask those questions, because if you're just producing for yourself and it's purely a learning project, then you don't need to worry so much about, is there going to be an audience for it? But if this is something that you're doing in order to grow your business or to communicate with your customers, then you really do need to be clear about who it's for and what problems it's going to solve for them. So I think asking those questions before you start diving into the interviews is important to kind of have front of mind. I would say those would be the 2 main pieces of advice, because I could give so many more pieces of advice, but I think if you are starting, that's what you need to think about. Think about how you can get started as fast as possible, and who is it for? What problems are you solving?
I would echo that advice. And as you were talking, it occurred to me we should do another episode at some point in the future just to talk about this topic, and we can both kind of share our perspectives on this, having both done more than 100 episodes of a podcast at this point, and maybe get into the growth side of it as well. That would be interesting territory. But I know one other topic I want to make sure we cover before we close, in addition to podcasting, is that you have, within the last year, also created and launched an online course. You mentioned it earlier, Make Me a Metalearner, and I could ask a ton of questions about that, and I know listeners would have a lot of questions about creating and launching an online course, because it's something they do. But I'll start with kind of going back to your topic area, this whole meta-learner concept, which is what you're trying to teach. And we talked about this a little bit recently in one of the openings to our online conference about, there's a fellow who started a creative writing program way back in North Carolina. It's one of the first ones. Fred Chappell was his name. And people kept asking him, can you teach creative writing? Is that something that can really be taught? And he got a little tired of the question, and he finally came up with his standard answer, which was, it can't be taught, but it can be learned. And I'm wondering if the same thing is kind of true about meta learning. I mean, when you think about teaching people to be meta learners, I mean, how do you think about teaching that, and how do people actually learn that? So I guess I'm sort of at the conceptual level around your course and how you approached it.
Sure. I really think that sort of that maxim of it can't be taught, but it can be learned applies to this, because ultimately meta learning is about you developing an awareness of how you learn. So I couldn't possibly teach you or anyone else how you learn, but I can give you a set of tools and techniques and a kind of broader framework and structure that will allow you to explore that in a way that means that you actually do it, as opposed to saying, oh, I'll do that later, or, one day or someday or maybe. So the way I kind of see Make Me a Metalearner is twofold. One, it walks you through the process of learning a new skill. So when you start off in section 1, which is the meta piece, you choose the skill that you're going to go through the entire course with. And then you kind of progress through the different phases of picking what materials you're going to use, the process of actually learning, and then maintaining that. But obviously the other very important, if not more important dimension of the course is that by doing that, you develop an awareness of how you learn. And there are various touch points in the course which are encouraging you to reflect on what you're doing and thinking about how you can improve it. So if you started off, say, wanting to learn basic Spanish, conversational Spanish, so that you could, say, speak to a native Spanish speaker for 30 minutes without having to drop into English, you not only have the ability to do that at the end of the course, but you also have the ability to apply what you've learned about your learning process to other skills.
I think that's fantastic that you root it in a particular skill or knowledge. And I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, I'm going to make a pitch to our listeners, because many of them, most of them are serving a base of learners basically around a particular skill or knowledge area. And I can see, and I'll say you did not put me up to this, Nasos. This is my own idea, but I'm going to promote your course here to say that these organizations, these learning businesses, should really be licensing Make Me a Meta Learner and promoting it out to their learner base, because it's going to help them create better learners who are going to be more engaged with what they are teaching, and it's going to ultimately make sure that they have a higher impact because the learners are going to be better prepared. So I think there's fertile territory there for that, and I'll humbly propose that to listeners as something to consider. One other question I'll ask you about the course before we start running out of time here is. You went through the process, you created it. I'm sure you've gotten feedback at this point. You kind of know how it's going. If there are one or two things that you would make sure you don't do the next time you create a course, what would those be?
So what would I not do next time I create it? I had the structure in my head for Make Me a Metalearner really a couple of years before I actually produced it. Now, I think that in part, it was good that I waited, because the kind of level of expertise that I developed over the course of those 2 years and all the conversations that I've had with people like yourself who are thought leaders in their spaces really, really did help me to kind of get a better grasp of what I was actually talking about. I also had 2 more years of experience of teaching and learning myself, which was extremely valuable. But I think I could have put together a first draft quicker. Because I did have people who were interested in what I was doing. And the key here is in the pitch. So if I'd gone into it and said, look, this is something that I'm working on to solve a problem for myself, would you guys be interested in checking it out and going through it and giving me some feedback? There might have been a way to be a little bit leaner and quicker and nimble at the start. Now, having said that, I think it's really, really important to believe in what you're putting out there. And this was an experience that I had, because I actually recorded my course first time round in April of last year. And I went back through it and I looked at it and I just wasn't happy with it. Like it just wasn't right. Something was missing. So I kind of went back to the drawing board. And it turned out what was missing was sort of a system, an organization. So the current kind of system that I have set up in 5 chapters, I think really takes people through the process in a way that they can understand. So yeah, I would say it's kind of a complicated piece of advice, I guess I'm giving, because on the one hand, I'm saying, don't worry too much about it. But on the other hand, I'm saying, worry enough about it to make sure that you're proud and happy to put your name behind it. And I guess it really is finding that balance and seeing what works for you. The other thing I would say, which I definitely will be doing for my next course, and I'm already doing to Make Me a Metalearner, is don't think that making your course more complicated will make it better.
Right.
If anything, it will make it worse. Worse, not in the sense that it's not good quality, but in the sense that it's a worse experience for the user. Because all of the things that I know or any course designer knows about their field of knowledge do not need to be communicated to students. The student needs to know the things that are going to get them from A to B. Presumably there's a reason why they've decided to enroll in the course. And so hopefully you can teach them that through the process of doing the course and give them little sort of snippets of awareness throughout the process. Ultimately, they'll then have the tools to go away and apply themselves afterwards. But I think there is certainly a temptation, there was on my part, to just put everything in and have this really, really comprehensive framework. And it's a long course. And that's why now I'm thinking, how can I make this a little bit simpler? How can I take this out and, convey the same meaning or have the same effect without saying so many words? So that's another thing I would say is, complicated does not equal effective.
That's such a hard lesson to truly learn. I think I've been told that I don't know how many times, and I still struggle with doing that whenever I'm putting together anything that I'm trying to teach. So definitely worth repeating again and again and trying to do. Now, one final question here, something that we ask all guests on the Leading Learning podcast, and in this case, it just seems like a particularly appropriate and relevant question, and that is, could you tell us about one of the most powerful learning experiences that you personally have been involved in as an adult, since you finished your formal education?
Sure. So I'm going to cheat, Jeff, and I'm going to give you two. Okay. Because the second piece is kind of a little bit of a cheat answer, but let me start with the first one. So after I graduated from university, and as I was saying before, kind of decided that I didn't want to go into banking and finance. One of the things that I had promised myself was that I was going to go and do a trip to Brazil. Now, I wanted to go to Brazil for a couple of reasons. One, I'd always kind of been fascinated by the culture and the music. And two, I was then a bigger football or what you guys would call soccer fan. And in 2014, it was the World Cup.
Right.
And so I kind of wanted to go and watch the Greek national team and see, Brazil play and just be there for that kind of massive cultural melting pot of people from all over the world coming for a major sporting event. And so I, in order to kind of make the experience as fun as possible for myself, and just because I also love the process of learning languages, I kind of learned Portuguese beforehand. So I learned by doing basically conversation classes with a friend of a friend here in London who was Brazilian, and then went out and traveled in Brazil for like 2.5, 3 months. Which was great because I was there before the World Cup, during, and then afterwards as well. So I got to see the country when, it was unspoiled, then during all the craziness, and then after as well. The reason why that was just such a profound experience for me, one, I traveled alone. And so I was meeting new people all the time. Because of the fact that I could kind of speak the language, and I really picked up when I was there and left pretty much fluent. I was able to just engage with like the locals in the cities that I went to in a way that was just on just such a deeper level than I would have been able to otherwise. And I learned an awful lot about myself in that process of kind of traveling and speaking to people and just kind of looking back at my life in London from a very different perspective, and having the time and space to do that without having to go, rush back to a job or, worry about some sort of, business that I already had there. And I realized that's not possible for everyone at all times. But that kind of combination of the situation and the experiences that I had just made it an incredibly profound learning experience for me personally. And then the second answer, the cheat answer, is kind of what we referred to a lot over the course of this conversation, which is Metalearn. I started Metalearn shortly after I came back from Brazil to start documenting my thoughts on teaching and learning. It started off just as a simple blog. I remember it like it was yesterday, the first article that I wrote on like that simple WordPress site that I had set up. And over the course of the project, which has now developed into a blog, podcast, videos, the course, and everything like that, I've learned skills that I could never have dreamt I would be able to kind of learn as fast. And it's just purely from doing it, interviewing, branding, presenting, selling, writing, like all of these things have come as a result of Metalearn. And so, that has been a truly profound learning experience as well.
Well, one of the things I really appreciate about you is that you walk the walk. So I love it, that you went to Brazil and you learned Portuguese before going to Brazil, and I'm sure learned it a lot better once you were there. So fantastic. Well, just to wrap up here, for listeners here at Leading Learning, how can they find you? How can they find out about the course, the podcast, and in general connect with you?
Sure. So they can go to the homepage of my site, metalearn.net. That's META learn.net. And they can, if they want to find out more about the course, click on the courses tab. There's a podcast tab for all the podcast episodes. If they want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is NASPAP3. That's NASPAP3. And yeah, you can find me, I'm sure, in plenty of other places around the internet as well.
Well, Nasos, thanks so much for joining us on the Leading Learning Podcast.
Jeff, thanks so much for having me on. It was a real pleasure chatting to you.
That wraps up our interview with Nasos Papadopolous. To get show notes for this episode, just go to leadinglearning.com/episode 122. This includes a link to get to those MetaLearn videos that we mentioned at the outset that we highlighted as the resource for this episode.
And while you're there at the show notes, you'll also see the various options that we have for subscribing to the podcast. And if you are getting value out of what you hear and haven't subscribed yet, we'd be truly grateful if you would choose one of those options and subscribe today.
We'd also be grateful if you would take just a minute to give us a rating on iTunes. You can do that by going to leadinglearning.com/iTunes. We really appreciate the ratings and the reviews, and it also helps others to find the podcast.
And we'd be grateful if you take a minute to visit our sponsor for this quarter, Blue Sky eLearn. We really do put a lot of work into producing and delivering Leading Learning, and one of the key reasons we're able to do that is because of the support of sponsors like Blue Sky. So please visit them at blueskyelearn.com, and if you happen to end up talking with them, be sure to tell them that you heard about them on the Leading Learning podcast.
Finally, consider telling others about the podcast. You can send out a tweet simply by going to leadinglearning.com/share, or if tweeting isn't your thing, you can pick another social network of your preference and spread the good word that way.
So thanks again, and we'll see you next time on the Leading Learning